Hello and welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to go over 1 Samuel chapter 17. For those of you at the church, we continue our series on 1 Samuel. And if you are wondering what are the other sermons, if you haven't listened to them at church, you can check them out in the description down below and the link for the Facebook page. All of the sermons should be posted there for your enjoyment. So when it comes to 1 Samuel, we have been going over the stories of pride and prejudice, right? We first saw a story of prejudice where Eli was disdaining Hannah and then how she reacted and taught us a couple lessons. And then last week we saw a story about pride. We're back to kind of like a mix-up of a little bit when it comes to chapter 17. This is a very known story, but I want to focus our experience or the lens in which we see it from a different perspective. This is a story of David and Goliath. And when it comes to David and Goliath, most of the time when we hear preachers, we usually will hear how we are David, we are the, at the service of the army of God, and we're trying to defeat the enemies, right? And while that has some validity, I want us to focus a little bit more on Goliath today and some of the deficiencies that he has and some of the things that he has when it comes to prejudice. Also, we're going to showcase how Goliath and the army of Israel are kind of similar. So let us start with the story and see what we can learn from Goliath and also from the understanding of this whole chapter. As a reminder, I always like for you to have your Bible so that you can take notes. And if you have a computer or something else, just make sure to take notes as we go through the story and the explanations that I may give or some details that you may have missed. But essentially starts like this, 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah, and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain of the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. Now, before we continue, I want to kind of explain what's going on over here. So in ancient battles, and this actually was a practice that continued probably all throughout, even up to the 19th century. It was not until the 20th century that we see a little bit more of a disorganized kind of battle. People used to line up. You have one battalion, and then you have the other battalion. And the first things that happen is not that they go to battle right away, but rather they cite themselves for a time where they're going to have the battle, as gentlemen would do at this time, or as honorable people, as they would say. But essentially what they are doing is playing a game of chicken. Because it's kind of saying, hey, I have a bigger army than yours. You don't want to lose your men, so just gently retreat and we will win this battle. This is something that was actually very useful because you did not have to lose your men to the battle and you won the battle. You may have the loot that they leave in the camp and then you go back victorious because you defeated the army. This is very customary in ancient battles because you don't have to lose men, and you can also win a couple of rewards just by playing a game of chicken. So now the Philistines and the Israelites, one on one side and one on another side, they start to play this game of chicken. And all of a sudden, the Philistines bring out their secret weapon. So let's see what the secret weapon is in verse 4. It says, "And there came out of the camp from the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of the bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him." I want you to notice there, the first thing that we're going to notice about Goliath is that he had somebody with him. He had a shield bearer. Now, we know that Goliath was massive. He was a very tall man by any standard today. He was taller even than any, basketball player or the tallest man that you can imagine. He was what we consider a giant. And Goliath was so tall that he had some physical deficiencies as well. He could not walk by himself, and that's why he has a bearer with him, a shield armor bearer, because number one, he has a lot of heavy clothing, but also because he's so tall. His dexterity was not so advanced per se. As you may encounter, especially in different people, the taller you get, the harder it is in certain places, right? Like playgrounds or going into certain houses. If the ceiling is too short, then you may have to hunch and go around and here and there. Whereas if you're smaller, you can kind of shift around in different places. Goliath was not only tall, but he was also massive in weight and size, because as the description tells us, he was just very, having all of this armor around him. So he's a little bit slow when it comes to this battle. Nonetheless, he starts playing the battle of chicken. So let's continue with the reading. Verse 8. It says, "He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, 'Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants.' And the Philistines say, 'I defy the ranks of Israel to this day. Give me a man, and we may fight together.' When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." So the game of chicken is working at this point. And this is when it comes to our series on pride and prejudice, right? Here Goliath is displaying pride. A little bit later, he will display prejudice. Now, many preachers, and understandably so, because we want to identify with the winner, we usually identify with David. Because he comes, he is valiant, he goes around and he says, "I will take this in the name of the Lord." And that is true. We should usually be, valiant and, take the charge and say yes to the Lord and go out and help people, evangelize others, and, defeat the enemies that we have, which is the devil and his agencies. As Paul says, we are not fighting against blood, we're not fighting against one another, but we are fighting against principalities, powers, and potestates and magistrates that we cannot even see. So the battle is spiritual rather than physical. So we try to identify with David, who has a physical battle, but we translate it to our understanding of in Christianity, which is we're trying to battle the spiritual battle and come out above it. And while that is very good, the reality is that sometimes we're like Goliath. We sometimes think, well, I am better than you. I am better than my neighbor. I go to church. I have the truth, right? Especially during this time around, and as we see in America, the election is drawing. I see more people in their Facebook feeds or in their comments on different YouTube channels or even on their posts or even in their conversations. They say, "I know which party I'm going to vote for. I am right. You are wrong." And then they start kind of playing the game that Goliath is playing, this game of chicken. Well, I am right. You are wrong. Are you going to join me? Because if you join me, you will be happy, right? And that is what usually happens also in Christianity. In our churches, sometimes we can act like that. We can be very prideful and prejudiced upon people that may look differently than us. Did you look at the pastor? He did not have a tie. Did you look at that sister? Look at her skirt, how short it was. Or did you look at how much makeup that person had? We start criticizing people. We start thinking that we're better. And we start playing the game of chicken in the same way that Goliath is playing it. While we may want to identify with David most of the time, sometimes we're just like Goliath. Let's continue with the story and see how David intervenes. It says now in verses 17, "And Jesse said to David his son, 'Take your brothers an ephah of his parched grain and these 10 loaves and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000, see if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them.'" So David enters the story. He is just a young man. He is very valiant. He's coming to bring food to his brothers. Now there is a couple of discussions that happen in there. We're going to skip them, but I invite that you listen and that you read them at home because it's very important there. David has an interaction. He listens to what Goliath is saying, right? The game of chicken that he's playing. And all of a sudden, we see that his brothers are like, "Go back home. You are not prepared for battle. Why do you want to fight Goliath?" And then they go back and forth. Then the news get to Saul, and we get to the next part of the story. So as David comes to the camp, he brings all the food. He goes to Saul. And look at this. And I think this is the important part right here because it showcases how Goliath had a lapse in judgment and how Saul didn't. At least at this point. We're going to continue with Saul in the next sermon about pride and prejudice. So when it comes to verse 31, it says, "When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when the lion came, or a bear, and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Interesting right there, we see Saul, he has a little bit of prejudice showcasing there. At the end of the day, David convinces him and takes away that prejudice that Saul has. Saul has the prejudice that says, "You are not prepared for battle. You are not ready. You are just a youth. And this guy has been fighting since his youth. What do you think you're going to do?" But David showcases strength and valiancy in the eyes of prejudice. In the same way that Hannah disregarded the comments, grabbed it, and spun them around with Eli, David does the same thing. And this is one of the reactions that we ought to have with prejudice. When somebody looks down upon us, we ought to try, to put our best, be resilient, and look forward. Now, I'm not saying accept that. Again, I've been very clear when it comes to that. We don't accept the abuse. We don't condone it. We don't say that is right. But if it happens, we have to arise and, as Christians, look forward into the solution. Sometimes we try to look into the problem and focus on the problem so much that we forget that we have to look for a solution. And to look also without that prejudice, because prejudice can be a double-edged sword. If somebody looks down upon me, I usually will look down upon them. I take their prejudice, hatred, whatever it is towards me, and I spun it around and spit it back out. That is so usual because it's the easier way. But David and Hannah so far have showed us that when somebody looks down upon us, we have to take the bigger step. We have to be resilient and show them a better way. And this is what David does. David says, "Hey, look, I may look like a scrawny little kid and I am just a youth, but I have experience. I have something. I have heart, and I want to go fight the battle." And Saul at the end ends up repenting from his prejudice and allows him to go. But Goliath doesn't. So let's continue with what it says. After this, you may know, actually, before reading this, that, David was clothed with a big armor. It didn't work. And now he goes pretty much just empty-handed, and everything just goes by himself, grabs a couple of stones, and we get to the climax of the story, right? So the next verse says, "And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David, from his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, 'Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?' And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, 'Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field.' Then David said to the Philistine, 'You come with me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut your head off. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand.' When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine." Now we see towards the end of the story what was the mistake from Goliath. That can be the mistake from a lot of us. We sometimes think that we know better. We sometimes think that we're prepared for battle. And we sometimes think that our enemy is not prepared. And that is the mistake of Goliath. He thinks that David is not powerful enough. He is not taking into account that David has advantages that he doesn't. Goliath is very tall. Goliath is very slow. He needs a shield bearer to go before him. because of his lack of swiftness and dexterity. He also, as you see, does not have a very good sense of vision. We can infer this from where he says, "Why are you coming to me with sticks?" It seems that he understands that there is a human in there, but he doesn't seem to have the best vision, as the text kind of reflects. So we see this idea that Goliath was not ready for battle because he thought that he was ready and nobody else was going to come meet him. This is essentially what happens in a game of chicken. In a game of chicken, you're trying to defeat your opponent. You're trying to make sure that your opponent, backs down before you back down. Goliath was not ready. And sometimes we can be like Goliath. We sometimes think, "Oh, I've got it. No problem. I can fix this. I can fix that." Or even worse. I'm trying to put some trivial examples, but there is a deep significance in here when it comes to Goliath and us. We can be like Goliath when it comes to our enemy, the principalities and powers and magistrates that we do not see. That is, the devil and his agencies. We may think, I'm ready for battle. No matter what happens, I'm never going to go back to that addiction. I'm never going to sin again. Sometimes we may think. But if we're not ready, if we're not covered like David was, with an unction of the Holy Spirit, we are weak like Goliath. We may be victims of our own prejudice. And we may think that we are ready and that nobody else is, and that Satan is not powerful enough, and that I can do it all on my own. And then we fall, just like Goliath did. Let's finish the story and let's see what happens at the end. It says, "And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David." So we see now David delivers. He is the valiant, the champion of Israel, just a youth. Saul did not think that it could happen because he was prejudiced against David. You're just young. You're not good or good enough in order to go to battle. Goliath also commit the same sin. He said that, "Hey, you're not good enough. Why are you here? I'm going to give your flesh to the birds." But again, David knew better. And Goliath, or we can be like Goliath or Saul. We can just push aside people. We can look at others and say, "No, I have the better answer." Let's put aside our prejudice for some time. Let's put aside and welcome everybody and make sure that we are good examples and that we're valiant like David. Of course, we have to recognize that David has a lot of good qualities. Up to this point, we'll get to a little bit more of pride and prejudice when it comes to the book of 1 Samuel and when it comes to David. But the reality is that we ought to look into how not fall into the traps that Goliath and Saul fell, which is look at others with disdain, not look at them for the potential that they can have, and just overall hate on the people that we're supposed to love. God has called us to be better people, to be loving people, and to make sure that we are a community of people that support and love one another. So my challenge for you this week is that you find people, that you love them, that you take care of them, and that you don't let them go. Let's not be like Goliath with the prejudice. Let's not be like Saul with the prejudice. But let's look upon people and let's help them and let's find the community that God wants us to have. Thanks for watching this video. We'll see you in the next one. And again, if you want to watch all of the ones from this series, make sure to go to the description, the link in the description down below. So thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you in the next one.